finish what you started, you came to the right place. Them girls that you came with, you might have to part with, depending on how this thing shakes. Wauwatosa, Kenosha, Oconomowoc is in the house.
Welcome to another episode of the New Look podcast, where we're going to be taking a new look at a variety of issues, a variety of legal issues. We're joined by a friend of mine, the man, the myth, the legend, Josh Geltzer. Joshua, welcome to the New Look podcast.
Thank you, Mike. I'm looking forward to this.
Well, this thing is, it's gone viral is probably the best way to describe it. There's tens of followers across Wisconsin, mostly my family members. So my mom is
don't forget about my family members. My family members too.
That's right. The Geltzer Gallagher families are really going to be watching this. But Josh and I have known each other for a long time. We went to college together. But for those who don't know your hero origin story, Josh, let's start with, where are you from? Where'd you grow up?
Manhattan. Grew up in New York City. Had the good fortune to walk to school for 13 years to the same building, to Hunter High School in Manhattan. And my folks still living in the city.
I've always been fascinated by the idea of like growing up in Manhattan. Like, it just seems it's so far afield from my own experience. Like, no one has lawns or like neighborhoods. Like, how does that even work?
I think we took for granted the ways in which it was easy and the ways in which it was hard. So in some ways it was easy. I mean, to the extent that kids get into trouble because they're bored, you're not really bored growing up in Manhattan. You can walk usually, or if not, hop on the bus, hop on the subway, and you can go to a ball game, you can go see a hockey game, you can go see a movie. You know, there's things to do that kids can actually do, you know, for themselves, at least at some age. On the other hand, there are ways in which it's hard. You don't have that kind of outdoor space that at least some people are fortunate enough to have in other parts of the country. You're packed in a sense. I used to think of Central Park as our backyard. It just took a little while to get there, but once you get there, you got some outdoor space. But I love growing up in Manhattan. It's definitely different from others, but it was fun. Yeah.
So in terms of ball games, you were a big Mets fan growing up, right? Still are, correct?
I'm a rare New Yorker in which the Mets are doing all right, I'm behind them. If the Yankees are all right, I'm behind them. I'm not a bandwagoner. I've been through really bad years with both of them. And I know what it's like to like one side of a crosstown rivalry and not the other, because I'm a Rangers guy and not an Islanders guy. But I'll take some good years from the Mets and the Yankees, and I'll cheer for them.
But you are a big baseball guy. Like, you enjoy obsessively watching baseball, correct?
Love baseball, absolutely.
So I feel like baseball's missing a huge opportunity right now to fill the vacuum being left by sports. And I haven't even followed what the deal is with their negotiations and the dispute between the players and the owners. But right now they could be getting a whole nother generation hooked on baseball, but they're going to miss that opportunity. And I feel like the next generation doesn't like baseball that much. It's too slow.
I agree with you. And right now I miss baseball so much. Every morning when I wake up, I look at the scores of the NC Dinos, the South Korean team that I have decided is my team. My cap came in the mail literally today. I got an NC Dinos cap now. They are, first of all, they're playing great baseball, but they've also got a heck of a mascot. I would encourage your listeners to Google and see what Swole Daddy is. He's been nicknamed actually by an American fan. They've got a heck of a mascot. They're playing great baseball. And if Major League Baseball is not going to give me something to cheer, I'm going to find it halfway around the world.
I wonder if there's going to be some innovations. Like I think the exhibition golf match with Brady, Manning, Tiger, and Phil had like crazy number of viewers. I wonder if some of these things aren't going to become like permanent fixtures. And I think there's a cool way you could figure out how to do NBA playoffs even in the absence of a crowd. So I'm wondering how many different like sports innovations the coronavirus is going to create.
That's the thing about this. This is obviously awful and tragic and hard and all sorts of things, but it's not going away all at once, and it's yielding some innovation. And that's what we need. We need ways not only to do the serious stuff and get people healthy and get people back to work, but things to cheer for and things to distract us. And sports have played a role through through world wars, through all sorts of things in this country. It would be nice to see them doing more of that as the current situation drags on.
Yeah, for sure. So did you grow up in high school? Did you play sports? You're actually a deceptively aggressive basketball player. I know this firsthand. I don't mean that to offend you. I just don't think, first glance, I'm not sure, I think Geltzer's going to be throwing bows in the post, but you're a vicious basketball player.
What you lack in talent, you make up for in how aggressively you play. That's not a quote from anyone. That's just my own
Bismarck. I think it was
philosophy.
Bismarck.
It was Otto von Bismarck taught that to me. That's right. But I still play basketball. At least I did before we all had to start this social distancing thing. And I did proudly played baseball, roam center field for the much feared Hunter Hawks growing up in Manhattan. And I still have, occasionally on a nice day, I get that feeling of school's over. It's Manhattan, right? There's not a lot of room for baseball fields. So we played at some fields way up in Inwood at the very top of Manhattan. We played on a couple of fields really right on the East River and the drive there, the FDR Drive. You'd see the light glinting off cars as you tried to track the ball off a hitter's bat. It was great.
Nice. Go Hawks,
I usually did not track the ball off the hitter's bat, but I tried.
Okay, so you go from Hunter to Princeton, which is where we met. Did you go to college knowing what you wanted to do? Like, did you have a sense of what you wanted to major in and what you want to focus on, or did you just kind of go and think, all right, I'll take some classes and figure it out along the way?
I really didn't know. I think if you look back at what I said I major in when I applied to Princeton, I think I might have checked classics. I loved Latin, took 6 years of Latin in high school, and I loved it. And the day that I registered for my first semester of courses at Princeton was Tuesday, September 11th, and 2001. And my parents were downtown that day, unhurt, fine, obviously quite terrified, but completely unhurt. But to the extent I was deciding between something that felt more of the world, more policy law engaged versus maybe something a little more academic like classics, that day was a big contributing factor to thinking there are some serious problems that I'd like to at least study and see if I can ideally get involved in helping with over time.
So, unlike me, you seemed to grasp the idea during college that studying was important and like doing well in your coursework was important. But I always admired you were always very balanced. You weren't just in the library all day. You were somehow able to be excellent academically while also being a normal person and having fun. I was good at sort of the second half of that, but not so much the first half. But I'd be curious. I mean, did you when you sort of neared the end of Princeton, what were kind of the options you were considering? I know, you got a Marshall Scholarship, but was there ever anything else you were thinking about doing prior to that, or just talk about kind of that shift from college into post-college life?
Yeah, I thought by that point I wanted to focus on foreign policy issues, national security issues. I was applying to graduate programs in the U.S. when I got the good news that I was going to get to go study on the Marshall in England. I thought about law school a little. My parents are both lawyers, and so the idea of going into law was certainly there before me, but it didn't feel as salient or as prominent then as a desire to keep working on national security issues. And as you know, because you and I would talk about some of these issues even in college, I was particularly interested in this idea of how actors in international affairs see one another, how they think they are seen by one another. And, this is 2005, I guess. I'm graduating spring of 2005. We were still in the aftermath of the Iraq War and in particular, what seemed like a very avoidable, at least, breakdown in U.S.-European relationships, or at times even civility, over what to do about Iraq, when to do it, how to do it. And so those issues were what guided me in particular towards staying in the national security space.
Which just reminded me, I think if I'm correct, your senior thesis was entitled Communication Breakdown, which is obviously an allusion to a Led Zeppelin song, in addition to being about signaling and actual communication breakdown. Is that right?
That's a great memory, and it is. I hope. I obviously assume that the members of Led Zeppelin are listening to this, and I hope that they appreciate that I did not take that title in vain. I did once thereafter. Was in a pub in London a couple of years after graduating college, and Robert Plant walked in to the bar.
No
and
way.
You will be relieved to know that in my 10 seconds of introducing myself to a music legend, I did not mention this.
It'd be great if you had a copy of your thesis in your back pocket. You're like, Mr. Plant, you got to read this. Go for it.
Read. Read.
It's a great read.
Maybe some lyrics in here for your next album. I don't know. Maybe.
That's right. Well, that also is an important thing I overlooked, which is that you were in a band in college, which I probably watched that band play like 50 times at least. There weren't a lot of bands in the marketplace, student bands at Princeton.
Limited options. Top Shelf was the band.
Top Shelf was the name of the band, and it was always the top shelf option, only because there were no other shelves or other options on those shelves.
That's the kind of market we wanted, where we were the best option because we were one of the only.
That's right. And you were lead guitar in Top Shelf, correct?
I was. Occasionally, they let me sing on a couple of songs, but usually that's when you would see the crowds, and I'm using that term generously, of course, the crowds had to pick up another beer or something was when I would take over the vocals. But guitar I could play.
Well, this is what if nothing else comes out of this podcast, I just want people to know that lurking beneath this mild-mannered, bespectacled exterior is a rock legend and a fierce pickup basketball player. So this is what it's taken me a while to learn this about you, Josh, but what I respect most about you.
So far as I'm concerned, we can wrap this now. These are the key points that I was hoping to get across.
Done. We will. Let's plant the flag there, and in the last 10 minutes, I want to come back to your and my failed band project. Well, I wouldn't say failed so much as, it's really just in the early stages right now.
Long-term project.
Long-term project. Very long-term project where we're gonna heal the country through the power of rock. But
one chord at a time.
That's right. Okay, so take us through just quickly kind of grad school, law school, to what you've done in government to the present day.
Yeah, sure. So as we were talking about, I went to London, studied at King's College London in the War Studies Department, and wrote a PhD dissertation on this issue of signaling and perception as it applied to U.S. terrorism policy, roughly in the first 4 years under President Bush. And along the way, got interested in law, especially national security law, because in trying to understand what signals that administration thought it was sending, the ways in which it wanted to show a different counterterrorism posture after 9/11 from what the U.S. had before, you couldn't grapple with that without wondering about law and some of the non-legal questions raised by U.S. counterterrorism. So I went to law school with a goal of focusing on those issues. And after law school, clerked a couple years for federal judges, and then went to the Justice Department, to the National Security Division. And I think it's something to be savored if you can actually go try to do in government the things that you've been studying, the way, things you and I had talked about even as undergrads in terms of national security. So I was at the Justice Department for a couple of years, was on loan then to the White House, to the National Security Council for a couple of years, first as a lawyer and then as Senior Director for Counterterrorism. Stayed about 6 weeks into the transition under President Trump, overlapped with a really wonderful human being, my successor, Chris Costa, who took over as Senior Director for Counterterrorism, and then left government, and I've been for a little over 3 years around law, where I run something called the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection.
At Georgetown Law School, correct?
That's correct. That's right.
So I think that's a perfect way to segue into some of the issues we want to discuss. And I think I should disclose at the outset, I think, Josh, when it comes to counterterrorism issues, I don't think there's much daylight between us. But I do think it's fair to say at a broader level, we may come at this from a different perspective. But what I've always appreciated about you, beyond the fact that I respect your intellect, is your intellectual honesty. And I think you've been willing, even in recent years, to take some positions that were difficult for you. If I remember correctly, arguing in the Washington Post for the president's ability to fire kind of whoever he wants in some cases. But conversely, you've also been leading lawsuits against the administration. But I always look to you not only as an expert on counterterrorism, but really when I want to challenge my own thinking on legal issues, which is an area where I don't know as much about. And I want this podcast, too, to be kind of increasingly a forum where I can have people with different perspectives on to challenge my thinking, and we can have a respectful debate. And the fact of the matter is we're also good friends. So despite differing views, well, at least I feel that way, Josh. I don't know how you feel about that.
I feel the same. And I really do hope listeners will realize that as much as DC, I think, increasingly gets portrayed as stuck, people kind of stuck or automatically falling into positions. One of the many things that I admire so much about you, Mike, is you are grappling with those things. You are asking questions. You are talking to me and other people and challenging assumptions. And people don't often realize, I think, that's happening in a DC that can feel polarized and rigid right now. But you do it all the time, and I admire that a lot.
Well, I also, it was interesting. Yesterday, I did an Instagram Live. I'd never done one of those before. I'm like the least tech savvy millennial in Congress, with Ro Khanna, who's a colleague of mine who is not only Democrat, but a super progressive Bernie Sanders Democrat. And he was kind enough to invite me to do a Facebook Live with him. And we had a great discussion. I mean, he didn't ambush me with anything. And we actually see eye to eye on a lot of congressional reform issues. But it's fun. Like, as we were doing it, I was watching all the comments, and it was all, you're the worst. Like, until you burn Donald Trump in effigy on the streets, like, we won't even listen to you. I'm like, all right, come on, people. Let's keep it. Let's have a discussion here.
This
is
so important because we all find it easy to have discussions that are basically preaching to the choir, right? We all find it easy to have somebody reaffirm that we're right, and then to reaffirm right back at him or her. But what I think we need right now is the ability to have conversations with people with whom we don't always agree, or might not agree, or don't even have a view yet, and are open-minded. And it's great that you did that, and you should keep doing more of that stuff. I think it's terrific.
Well, I'll use that as a segue to just the question of social media. And I want to confess my prior here is that, the minute I'm no longer in public office, I'm going to delete all my social media accounts. And I think social media is a corrosive force, and it's sapping our ability to think and challenge our viewpoints. But I get what I really want to talk to you about is this question of how we currently regulate the social media companies, whether we need to regulate them more, and then how they are sort of self-regulating speech on their forums. And I really don't know where to begin with that. So I'm just going to throw that huge hot potato in your lap, and maybe you can guide it in the right direction.
Yeah, let me begin maybe by saying something about the law. And the basic point about the law is that the law can't save us here. I think people increasingly, as they confront these hard questions about what it means to be and to have the reach of a Twitter or a Facebook, to then deal with somebody like a Donald Trump and how he uses that platform, or a government like Russia's or China's and how they use the platform. And I think you see this temptation to say there's a legal answer that will solve what's clearly a challenge, probably a set of challenges. And it's just not that simple, unfortunately. There is the First Amendment, and it does not apply to non-governmental actors. So the First Amendment isn't going to say how Twitter should or should not leave up or take down certain content. It may say things about what Donald Trump can do on Twitter, and there's an interesting case that's going through the court system right now about that, but that's very different from it saying something about Twitter or Facebook itself. Similarly, there is Section 230 Communications Decency Act, and we can talk some more about the details of it. Big picture, it provides a lot of, not total, but a lot of legal immunity. So blocks from lawsuits, the tech companies. And that was put in place in part to incentivize them to figure out a way to moderate themselves in what was really an emerging unusual, unprecedented set of technologies. So First Amendment, Section 230, they don't give us an answer as to what Twitter must do when Donald Trump engages in some of his rhetoric on there that at least some of us think goes to the point of inciting violence. They don't tell us what to do when Russians try to manipulate our democratic process by skewing and misleading and just outright lying about politicians and political issues. They shape and channel maybe some of the options for response, but unfortunately there's no easy answer from the law alone.
Why it's such an interesting issue that it's such a basic issue that's often overlooked, just the nature of free speech. I mean, Twitter's a private company. It doesn't have to guarantee you free speech on its platform, correct?
Correct. It happens to set up terms of service that roughly outline, almost law-like, when it thinks it will take down some comments or when it thinks it will suspend an account. But even those are, like, unfortunately, law can be sometimes, and the implementation can be harder than the principles. But it really certainly doesn't need, or subject matter, to have those at all. It could simply say, we're a private platform. If we like what you're saying, you can stay, Mike. If we don't like it, you're not part of our club anymore.
Well, interesting. So I think the problem of bias in these companies is a real one, and I think it mostly cuts against conservatives. But honestly, when I hear complaints about it, my initial reaction is, well, no one's forcing us to use these platforms. Is there some line at which the Twitters, the Facebooks, the Instagrams become so pervasive and so necessary for one's economic livelihood that they would cross into a realm of a public good, for lack of a better term? Does that make sense? I'm probably using the wrong terms.
No, it does make sense. And because our government, and I think a lot of governments around the world, have decided that there are some things that just have to exist for modern life to carry on. You need utilities, you need gas, and you need water, and you need electricity. And sometimes those are public entities, but sometimes those are private entities. And yet the government both wants to ensure that they continue to exist, because we really do need them. That's not like shutting down your Twitter account, and wants to make sure that what they deliver isn't price gouging, is consistent, isn't going to leave citizens unable to have necessities of life. So that is a category. Now, whether social media reaches that category, as you say, it doesn't seem to. And I say this, I do use Twitter. If it went away tomorrow, it wouldn't be as if the electricity in my house went away. And yet that misleads us as to the centrality of these entities in modern life, because even if any one of us could unplug from them in a way we can't take out the gas or the electricity or the water from our house, they are fundamentally changing our democracy and our society. They are changing how we see the news. They are changing how we think about political issues. They are often amplified by and in some ways guiding what we then watch on TV or hear on the radio. So even not like a public utility in the sense of every one of us needing to rely on them, they are quite central to democracy in 2020 at this point.
Well, so you clerk for the Supreme Court. Did any of these, did you work on any cases that were, that was at the intersection of this issue, or was this a debate that the justices had? Were there creative coalitions on this issue too? Because I sort of sense I don't know, there's almost a coalition between the kind of anti-tech media, social media right, and like the progressive left on this issue that I don't fully understand. I'd just be curious if you've ever been involved in litigation or when you were a Supreme Court clerk with these issues.
No, I clerked there 2012 to 2013, and there was social media then, but I'm not sure some of the issues that have made their way, especially up the ladder of the U.S. courts on things like the scope of 230 immunity, had really made their way there yet. But I think you're right that the extent of dissatisfaction with the current regime, I don't even mean legal regime, I mean just how the tech companies are operating and how they're relating to government, how they're relating to all of us as citizens, that dissatisfaction is unusually wide. When you ask what people are dissatisfied about, you may then get a breakdown, right? So you have folks on the right who say, we think it's a political bias in what's being removed or blocked. You have folks on the left saying they're doing too little to keep out maybe Russian attempts to intervene in our elections. You have scholars who, I'm not sure they even should get a political label, but who point to individual cases of bullying, harassment. I mean, people's lives really get ruined by what can happen online. Wonderful scholars like Danielle Citron who've written about it, and I don't even think of them as having a political valence. And then, of course, you have people in the tech community who, with some validity, point to how much these companies have done some good, injected some connectivity, spread some stories, how much they've done for the economy, and who point to 230 as the thing that enabled all of that precisely by ensuring that you could have sites where stuff just goes up and the platform doesn't need to scrutinize it beforehand. So we shouldn't say there are no defenders of the status quo. There are some, but I do think you're right that the extent to which there's dissatisfaction, at least with perhaps different aspects of it, is pretty unusual, especially for our current political moment where we all disagree on a whole lot.
So just, can we go one layer, as I drop my microphone here, drop the mic, Josh, I dropped the mic. Go one layer deeper on 230, or let's simplify 230. I mean, and maybe the best way to do that is explain why a Facebook is treated differently than the New York Times is treated in simplest fashion.
I think that's exactly the right way to start. So 230 came along because there were a couple of court cases before there was a Twitter, actually, before there was a YouTube, before there was a Facebook, earlier technologies. Think more like web forums where people were posting things and other people were coming along posting later. And some people didn't like what had been posted, so they brought lawsuits. Let's call them defamation. Somebody said something false about me that harmed me. And the question for the court was, what's the role of the tech company that's operating that web forum? Is it like the New York Times, where if the New York Times publishes an op-ed from me that's defamatory, yes, I can be on the hook for that, but the Times can be as well. So is there, let's call it publisher liability, or is there not? Is this simply a conduit? It would be more like somebody suing whatever broadband user you're using to connect right now if you said something defamatory. They're not scrutinizing what you say. They're just providing content for saying it, and there'd be no reason for there to be legal liability for them. They're not claiming or holding themselves out to be scrutinizing what you're saying. And the court split, and there was interest in Congress, including by a younger Ron Wyden at the time, in trying to provide an answer, first of all, but in particular to provide an answer that would say these new technologies don't need to be treated, should not be treated like the New York Times or the Washington Post, that there's a world in which they are facilitating speech that they are not checking first, scrutinizing first, deciding to accept or reject, editing, any of that, and that should be allowed to flourish. And so Section 230 was put in place so that on the one hand, entities could grow that didn't face that sort of liability, because you probably couldn't have a YouTube if YouTube were deemed the same as the New York Times is. But on the other hand, this is so important. On the other hand, there was already dissatisfaction about stuff online. There were congressional hearings on child exploitation imagery in particular, but other bad things online. And the goal was, if you're freed from traditional liability, that should give you, tech companies, the freedom to experiment a bit, to figure out what it means to actually moderate content in a way that suits you and suits you as a different type of media, really. And so it wasn't just to shield them. It was also to encourage and incentivize them to figure out how to be responsible, but just a different type of responsible, if that makes sense.
Totally makes sense. So it would be fair to say, I mean, we deliberately, via 230, took a light touch approach to these companies to shield them from liability, which is ironic now. Some of the biggest critics are coming from the right, and usually we're down with, a light touch regulatory approach. Strange times we live in, Josh. But, okay, here's where it gets complex, right? Because then you have ISIS exploiting the platforms. And you've worked intimately on the intersection of this and counterterrorism. Maybe talk a little bit about how you dealt with those issues when you were in the White House, and how the tech companies dealt with terrorist groups using their platforms.
This really became, especially by 2016, in some ways the main way in which those of us who worked on counterterrorism feared attacks against Americans on U.S. soil unfold. It's not to say we ever got cocky about people physically entering the country to do harm, but since 9/11, administrations of different parties have worked to secure our borders better, ensure that passenger data is scrutinized, and those going through visa or other sorts of processing systems are scrutinized. Physical entry had gotten tougher, and it should always be reviewed to make sure it's what it needs to be. But digital ways of getting into the country, reaching out through the internet and incentivizing, encouraging, radicalizing, and getting people to do the sorts of attacks we saw in San Bernardino, we saw at Pulse nightclub in Orlando. That was becoming ISIS's way of causing violence and really death on U.S. soil. So this was a major concern to those of us who worked on these issues. And to go back to Section 230, Section 230 has two notable carve-outs in a sense. Child exploitation imagery, the sorts of images that are actually unlawful, there's no immunity from liability for that. The companies need to get that off. Then there's also, as part of intellectual property law, some carve-out for intellectual property once a company has been put on notice that it's sitting on their site. So if you've used a piece of some movie or song you shouldn't have in a YouTube video, if the company should know about it and they let it stay up anyway, there's some potential liability there, but not terrorism content. And so this stuff was reaching Americans, and ISIS was, I don't know if prioritizing is fair, because they were also doing all the awful things at the same time. They were holding territory. They were purporting to govern, in a sense, the large swaths of territory they held at that point in Iraq and Syria. But the digital output, the ways in which they tried to get people in America and elsewhere to launch attacks based on slick videos and what they thought were cool-looking e-magazines, that was central to their strategy, and they were putting a lot of time and effort into it. And we were sitting there worrying about it, what it might do in terms of leading to violence perpetrated by those who couldn't be caught entering the country because they were already here, and then radicalized based on what they were consuming online.
Did I lose you? You cut out there. Can you hear me?
Oh, no, you're good. You're good.
Okay,
sorry.
We're going to have my team of, highly skilled videographers fix that in post-production. But
That's you, right?
That's just me in my basement here. So what, okay, but maybe tease out a little bit. So how did the companies and the government evolve? Did we find a productive balance? And what were the changes?
I think things got better. I don't think it's a problem solved or mission accomplished moment, but I think things got better. And especially after San Bernardino, President Obama gave a speech the Sunday night, I believe, after that attack, in which he explicitly called on the government and tech to work together better to address terrorism. It was just one line in a speech, but one line from a president can really, and so that led to a really an unusual gathering a few weeks later, I believe in January 2016, in California, where you had leading national security officials. You had Director of National Intelligence Clapper. You had then FBI Director Jim Comey. You had Attorney General Loretta Lynch. You had, I believe, Dennis McDonough, the staff, as well as Lisa Monaco, the president's top counterterrorism advisor, going to California to talk to tech companies. And it, quite interestingly, was not about encryption. Encryption was put on the side. That was an agree to disagree topic for the moment. It was, what else can we talk about? How can we get better? And I think coming out of that conversation, you did see tech companies begin to devote more resources, more attention to this issue. They announced a couple of things, this took me months, but I'm accelerating the story here. Yeah. First, they announced that they would share MD5 hashes, the digital signatures associated with things uploaded, so that once a particular ISIS image or piece of ISIS video had been identified as terrorism content, it could be blocked, not just by that company, but by other companies before it was uploaded, even if it was now repackaged into some other video or magazine. Then you saw the companies agree to share with each other technology to find that sort of stuff in the first place. And now we even see the tech companies saying that they are using machine learning to try to figure out what is terrorism content based on what's been flagged by real human users and validated in the past. So I think all of this is progress. You can still find this stuff online, and that's still a problem. But I do think you see the tech companies putting their considerable talents and resources and energies into trying to make the virtual space more contested, at least for groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda too.
So if I'm, just to wrap up on this, so let's say I'm an extremist, a Salafist, and I went on Twitter and I started tweeting all this stuff about the Zionist Crusader Alliance and how America's to blame for everything. So you can still do that, but at what point do I get taken down if I then say, and that's why, brothers, you all need to rise up and, kill as many people as possible in America? At what point does Twitter take action is what I'm getting at.
And it's a great question. Every company describes and in fact carries this out a little bit differently. But the companies generally say that terrorism content is now prohibited on the sites. So even before you get to the incitement or encouragement to violence, which they do say they'll take down, if a user says, here is the new ISIS video, ISIS is terrific, and this video should convince you that the group is where your future lies. At this point, generally, their terms of service would say, that's terrorism content. That glorifies a terrorist group. That should come down. Now, how long it actually takes to come down, whether it requires one user to flag it, 5 users to flag it, how much of a lag time there is, that answer is I think, a bit more complicated. And not necessarily a consistent answer, even within one social media platform, let alone across the platforms.
Does that not then open up a complicated set of issues around, okay, how do you define a terrorist group? Whose definition do you use? I mean, obviously, I think Barr has designated Antifa as a terrorist group in the last week. We've had a debate about domestic terrorist groups in that line. Is there a clear, does Twitter or Facebook just defer to the State Department's terrorist designations, or how does that basic definition work?
It's hard, and as you indicated, this week the Trump administration, I think via presidential tweet, said it was looking to designate as a terrorist group Antifa, which does not, in fact, make sense under U.S. law. Forget even whether there's a factual basis to think that. The two types of designation under U.S. law are both focused on foreign entities, the State Department-led foreign terrorist organization designation list and specially designated global terrorists. Both have this foreign or international focus. So,
wait, does that mean we haven't designated white supremacist groups as terrorist groups, domestic ones?
It's a great question, and the answer is basically yes. In fact, to this administration's credit, for the first time a few months ago, it designated the foreign affiliate of a white supremacist group as a specially designated global terrorist, SDG. But of the approximately 65 organizations designated by the State Department as FTOs, foreign terrorist organizations, not one is a white supremacist or white nationalist group, even though there are foreign incarnations of those groups. Domestically, we don't have a designation regime. Having one would really raise some tricky First Amendment issues.
Interesting. So you're saying there's currently no mechanism for designating a domestic terrorist group. Even if you were persuaded by the case that Antifa was a terrorist group, and I'm not suggesting you are, you're suggesting there's no mechanism for then an actual official designation.
That's right, because the things that are the consequences that flow from the foreign terrorist organization designation would run into constitutional concerns, at least if they were just mapped onto domestic entities. Let me give you an example. The Supreme Court has upheld a criminal conviction for providing just guidance, language on how to peacefully share an articulation of your grievances with a designated terrorist group. What the court said was, Congress has a theory here. These entities are so bad, dangerous, that anything you do for them, even if it's peaceful stuff, apart from exceptions written into the law, like providing medicine, any of that helps them as an entity overall. An overall entity contributes to violence in the world, contributes to something verboten, which is politically motivated violence. Now, if that were a pure domestic entity, it's not clear that you could ban peaceful speech. Now, to be clear, the FBI does investigate those individuals who may be committing crimes in part or in whole because of their relationship to a domestic terrorist group like the KKK, for example, or like some of the newer white nationalist, white supremacist groups. But that's not based on the sort of designation we have for foreign groups.
Wait, and forgive me if I'm not understanding this. So even in this, so would the KKK then not technically be designated as a domestic terrorist group?
That's right. It can be described by federal officials as doing things that fit the federal statutory definition of domestic terrorism, which I would suggest it very much does fit into. Yeah. But there is no designation of the KKK, let's say, as a domestic terrorist group in the way that there is a foreign terrorist organization designation of Al-Qaeda or ISIS. There just is not an analog domestic regime.
Interesting. Well, let's plant a flag there. Maybe we can circle back to some of the legal issues that we've dealt with in the last couple weeks. Sir, your video is a little delayed, so I hope I'm not talking over you, but you look to be talking emphatically right now without actual audio coming out, but it looks great.
I was talking before, so I'm glad that my gestures have caught up.
Okay, good. I'm just struggling to keep up with you mentally, so maybe this is helpful to me. So I want to go back to Twitter in 230 and fast forward from dealing with this in the context of terrorism and then now in the context of coronavirus, where we've seen a lot of Chinese Communist Party officials, I would say, exploit the platform to propagate conspiracy theories. I didn't like that, and so I sent a letter with Senator Ben Sass to @Jack Dorsey suggesting, hey, take a look at this, and I think a reasonable standard would be don't allow government officials on your platform if they deny access to their own citizen on that platform. Jack did not respond. He had a underling send a 20-page response just talking about how awesome Twitter is and looking forward to having the conversation with us, not even having engaged in the conversation. But, well, one, I'd like your take on that, and then we can talk about the recent changes where they're fact-checking the president and all that stuff.
Yeah. So I think these companies they started, let's put it this way. They started with maybe an ideological commitment, maybe a business commitment to being as hands-off as possible. And they sometimes talk about it in First Amendment terms, but as you and I talked about before, it's not really the First Amendment because they're private entities. But their philosophy, sometimes spoken, sometimes unspoken, seemed to be, we want to intervene as little as possible on the platform. More speech is, in almost all cases, better. And I just don't think the world has borne that out, unfortunately. And I'm a big defender of the First Amendment and of ensuring the government does not step in and infringe on free expression. But the idea that these platforms could simply say, the more the merrier, has turned out to, yes, yield really great things and connect people in awesome ways, but it's also led to terrorists radicalizing Americans on U.S. soil, and it's led to deliberate disinformation campaigns, including by foreign governments. And they can be the Russians trying to mislead Americans about what day to vote, whether to vote, whom to vote for, whether the Pope has endorsed a candidate, which, of course, he doesn't do, but that was something circulating heavily on social media in the 2016 campaign season. Or it can lead the Chinese government.
I'm Catholic. I hope I did. Come on.
Check Twitter after this. I bet you can find it somewhere. But don't retweet it because it's disinformation.
There we go.
But it's led to some really bad stuff circulating too. And I think coronavirus has been something of turning point, may be too generous, but it's shown how dangerous false information can be, right? If people, especially when they're more socially distant, so they're encountering other human beings less for their collective safety, if they're being told to try certain medicines or not do certain things, or told that a very real lethal virus is just a hoax, that can be a life or death thing. So I think the past few months have crystallized something that was already burbling over the past few years, which is it just won't do to say the more the merrier on social media, because some of what's circulating can be too dangerous for that philosophy really to be responsible, I guess.
And let me just confess, this is kind of, I get to this point where we're about to get to right now, where no matter how much I read and how much I try and educate myself, I feel like I can't figure out the way forward, because I just, this idea of how do you draw the line, and if you're going to have a body of even the most patriotic, smartest people at Twitter trying to say, okay, you can be on the platform, you can't, you can say this and you can't, it's just, I feel like it's impossible to draw that line. It's why my initial reaction to @Jack trying to fact check Donald Trump is like, whoa, this sets a very bad precedent. And also, where does it end, right? So are you going to fact check all the Communist Party people, which I think they actually now are, which I guess is good. But I mean, on any given day, I could give you 30 politicians on the left and the right who are saying things that have a tangential relationship with the truth, let's say. So I'm just confessing I've struggled time and again to make sense of this thing. So maybe you tell me what you think is the best path forward, whether you disagree with my analysis that it's a dangerous precedent for @Jack to fact check Trump. I would say I've gotten fact checked by newspapers before. The fact check process is imperfect at best. So it just concerns me, but I admit I'm way out of my depth.
You know, I'm still working to fact check some of the toasts that were given at your wedding, and it's proving very hard to track down some of those stories. So that's been a long-term project for me, though. We'll save that for a future podcast. So no, it's very hard. This is very hard. It's very easy, I think, to share the dissatisfaction that we were talking about earlier, the sense that these platforms are not where a healthy democracy or a safe society might want them. But where we do want them is a much harder question. And I don't think the choice really makes sense as a dichotomy, that either the status quo in which they're generally immune apart from the couple of carve-outs, or that they become the New York Times. I mean, that can't be right, because they're not the New York Times. The whole point of these platforms is that, you know, you or I get to tweet out our foolish thoughts without them scrutinizing them or editing them. So it seems that there's room for something in the middle. What in the middle? I actually think there is something to be learned. It doesn't work perfectly. It's something to be learned from the intellectual property exception to 230 immunity that I mentioned earlier, where what in part the strong behest of the entertainment industry, what Congress went ahead and did a number of years ago, was to say, if you have reason to know, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, I think they were really concerned about YouTube at the time. If you should know, because it's been flagged for you or because of repeat uploads, that some clip that is someone's intellectual property is sitting on your site, and you just let it sit there, you may not get the benefits of being immune from suit. You may, in fact, face a legal a lawsuit based on that. So I think the question becomes, what does reasonableness look like in the context of taking terrorism material down, or taking demonstrably false medical recipes in the middle of a global pandemic down? And in fact, the British government has grappled with something they called the Harms White Paper, as I recall. This was not beloved by all audiences, and it had a whole regulatory mechanism that was that can be debated. But what the element that I thought was most interesting about it was it tried to grapple a bit with this question of what reasonableness mean. If it doesn't mean like the New York Times, actually reading and editing an op-ed and fact-checking it, hopefully, before publishing it, what does it mean? So that if ISIS content is there, has been flagged, has been uploaded by the same account, well, maybe there'd be some reasonableness standard beyond, and if you're not meeting that standard, maybe 230 needs to be rethought. Now that's very contested. It's also very vague. Reasonableness is the word lawyers love to go to, and they don't really have a precise answer. But that seems to be the space where it leads a healthy conversation about how these companies remain the platforms that they are, because we're not going to live in a world without social media. It may evolve, and maybe the Twitter and Facebook
That's
aren't
my
even used
solution.
by your kid.
I'm like, I'm like the grumpy old man yelling, get off my lawn. Just unplug, man. You don't need them.
You are ready to be a dad. This timing of this baby that's come along is perfect if you're already in that mode.
I'm like the oldest, youngest member of Congress there is. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I didn't have any. I don't think I had more, but that's where at least I try to think about it, and that's where I try to think about. And the Europeans have played with this a bit. Now they have a different regime, different. They don't have our First Amendment, so the role of government in relation to speech can be different over there. But they've tried to set up time standards that certain types of content, if flagged, must be taken down if indeed validated as hateful or terrorism content within a certain amount of time. Again, I'm not sure that's the right fit, especially for an American legal regime. But I think what I'm trying to point both of us towards thinking about, I guess, is something in the middle where there's some reasonableness about scrutinizing this platform that really would fulfill what the architects of Section 30 knew they wanted to see. They didn't know what it would look like, but they knew they wanted to see something. They wanted to see responsibility by these emerging companies. And maybe there needs to be some nudge to actually get them there.
And then maybe just comment briefly. I think Facebook a few days ago announced that it's going to be labeling state-controlled media outlets, specifically from China. They're going to label CCP propaganda. I view that as constructive because these platforms, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, are central to the Chinese Communist Party's ability to wage ideological warfare against us. But did you follow that decision by Facebook? Do you think they've kind of threaded the needle in the right way?
I am for trying, and I think what it reflects is a recognition that's what you just said, really, Mike, which is that these platforms have become central to strategies of foreign governments to spread disinformation and ultimately, over time, kind of change how populaces, and through those populaces, governments think of them or are constrained in reacting to them or talk about their actions at home and abroad. And at the end of the day, I don't think the people who run these companies want to be arms of intelligence services of the Chinese. That's not really what they built these things for. How to avoid being those arms of state intelligence services, I think they've been, to my mind, slow and frankly continue to be slow in getting there. Labeling, the idea of labeling, it's in a sense consistent with the original ideological orientation that more speech is better, right? Because a label is actually more speech on top of speech, even if it's speech that you are flagging as problematic. But taking down speeches is not easy, and it is not a one and done thing, as you said before. I happened to applaud Twitter for finding that President Trump had just gone too far in some of his language, but he's not going to stop, and others way beyond him are not going to stop using these platforms to try to articulate things that could be very dangerous ultimately and very problematic. So I think these companies
with that,
feel a
are
need
they saying
to do more.
There's a different? Sorry, are they saying that there's a different standard for the president than for everybody else explicitly, or is that just sort of implied?
What the companies had, at least some of them, said explicitly over the past few years was that heads of state, political figures like Donald Trump, basically got exemptions. So speech of theirs that might trigger removal or flagging if it were uttered by you or by me would not trigger those same repercussions because the companies said it's inherently interesting, it's inherently important if a Donald Trump says this. In fact, there have been interesting stories this week. Somebody who decided to test this set up an account on Twitter, I believe it was on Twitter, and everything Donald Trump tweeted, he just retweeted, just cut and pasted it and tweeted it. And his tweets quickly blocked, flagged, encountered all the sorts of terms of service repercussions that an ordinary user would encounter. And it is, I understand that when a head of state speaks, in a sense, it's interesting, but in a sense, it can be more dangerous because people can listen to them way more, including on whether to self-administer certain drugs that won't actually make you better during a pandemic. So I think what you saw from Twitter with that notable first couple of steps to moderate the president's speech was actually peeling back a little bit the exception for someone like him that it had previously applied.
I
we'll
still
see where they go with it.
Yeah, I still think it's going to be an impossible line to draw and navigate, and I do think it will further inflame this question of bias. By the way, on the drugs thing, well, they definitely didn't censor all the physicians in my family who have been talking about hydroxychloroquine for the last 4 months. But I guess, well, it's difficult because this is uncharted territory, right? I mean, social media is a new phenomenon. But can we circle back to something? I think the reflexive solution that I've seen people on the left and the right retreat to is something you mentioned earlier, which is let's just treat them as publishers. Treat them as publishers. That's clearly what they are. Explain again. I know you touched on this. Why you think that's not workable?
And you know, I'm sympathetic to where those folks are coming from because they're beginning with that dissatisfaction that, believe me, when I was sitting in the White House and seeing this propaganda staying up and gaining followers and getting retweeted for days and days, that didn't just annoy me. That worried me. That seemed dangerous as a counterterrorism official. So I'm sympathetic to the idea that the status quo has its problems. But at least people generally mean by traditional publisher liability attaches to an entity that scrutinizes pieces of content, or at least should be scrutinizing pieces of content before allowing those to be issued on its platform. So, when I write an op-ed, the Washington Post, the New York Times, they read it and they make sure they don't think I'm saying anything defamatory, just anything wrong or foolish, before they then put it there as something stamped with their name as well as mine. On television, it's a bit different because you don't scrutinize. They don't ask what I'm going to say or ask you what you're going to say before you go on television. But the idea is they are kind of responsible. And if they're foolish enough to invite you or me, and we're people who tend to spread lies or even worse, defamatory statements that cause harm, well, they may have to be part of those who face the repercussions of that. That is just not how Twitter or Facebook is built. It's or YouTube. They're what makes them what they are, whether you like that or dislike that, is that if you put something up, it goes up.
Yeah.
There's no Facebook editor. There's no Twitter publisher. There's all of us having a messy, convoluted conversation. Now, that's not to say one couldn't imagine a world in which if, for example, terrorist content could be identified, even of a new variety, based on previous terrorist content, could there be some hold and then human review that then says, oh no, this isn't ISIS's newest propaganda video. This is a BBC story about how ISIS is retaking territory. We should allow it to go up. I think one could think about that. Certainly those committed to expression on these platforms think that that's censorship of a problematic variety. But all I'm saying is big picture. YouTube, Twitter are not built to think about, read about, edit, fact check the content that flows across them at astonishing rates before it goes up there. Instead, they're really built to do the opposite.
Well, nor is the AI at a point where it could recognize the context. The BBC example is probably the perfect one that you just, correct me if I'm wrong. I feel like outsourcing it to the robots will probably have its own problems and they'll destroy us all. So just to be clear, though, so if I started defaming you on social media, which I may do,
Which this podcast, I think, says, based on what you said about my guitar playing earlier.
There's more risk in you doing this podcast than for me, my friend. But you could still sue me for defamation. You just can't sue Twitter or Facebook or the vehicle I use to defame you, correct?
That's right. And people often want to go to the vehicle because sometimes, often the vehicle has deeper pockets, or sometimes it's hard to identify who the speaker was because of the fact that you can use these platforms with pseudonyms or with, accounts that don't actually reflect who you are. So it is, as you say, really about the responsibility of the intermediary, of the platform, that I think the attention has been placed.
So can you go a few minutes over here? I know we've
sure
kind of I want to connect this maybe to something. So we talked about publishers and the op-ed process. Did you follow this recent imbroglio with Senator Cotton over his op-ed on sending in the troops? And I bring that up because I think it is connected, and it also, I imagine you're on the opposite side of him in terms of the substance of the argument. My own view is that whether or not you think the Insurrection Act could be used or should be used in this case, that Cotton's piece was well argued, and I don't think it was necessarily factually inaccurate in any way. And indeed, he points out that the majority of the American people are on the side of, in a terrible situation, using the military to quell violence. But then it sparked this whole debate at the New York Times about the op-ed process. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'd just be curious if you followed that and whether this connects to anything we've been talking about.
Well, I hadn't thought about it, but you're right that it connects, because here, even though I don't think even the Times' harshest critics are saying that the piece gives rise to legal liability, that it's defamatory, although maybe I'm wrong, what some of those critics are saying, I think some of the more pointed folks from within the Times' own workforce, is that if Senator Cotton's proposal were carried out the way he seems to suggest, it actually could endanger vulnerable communities or even people who work at the Times. That's their argument. And so it shows that when the New York Times is involved, we do expect them to scrutinize what they publish, and we do expect to be able to have a debate over whether they made a good choice or a bad choice. That's true on the op-ed page. It's also true in terms of how they report the news. And we think of them as very much responsible for those choices. And there is an analog between that and the conversation you and I are having about Twitter and Facebook, where for a while Twitter and Facebook really wanted to, I don't think I'm caricaturing their statements, at least of a few years ago right now. We're not making any choices. Yes, we have we have terms of service, and they will lead us to take out some tiny, tiny percentage of what goes up to our sites if flagged for us and deemed to violate. But generally, we're not scrutinized. You can't even have that debate with respect to us that folks are having at the New York Times right now, because we're not playing that role. And I think we moved to a point, we don't think of Facebook or Twitter as the New York Times' op-ed page, but we're not willing to accept that there's just nothing there, because ultimately they're a company. And we think of corporate responsibility in a lot of contexts, right? We talk about whether clothing companies, shoe companies should use sweatshops. We talk about whether companies should cause environmental problems. Having a conversation about corporate responsibility and what it means for a particular type of company and the particular type of business that they run, that strikes me as a fair game conversation. It doesn't automatically yield an answer as to what Twitter should do about a Chinese official's tweet or Donald Trump's tweet. And it's not the same as the conversation about the New York Times, because they don't claim to be reading individual choices and publishing them the way the Times does. But are we allowed to talk about them up sometimes if we think they're making good or bad choices about what stays up or goes down? I think that's part of them maturing as companies. And I think we're allowed to have that conversation. I think we need to. Interesting.
So to put a fine point on it, if, let's say, the Insurrection Act was invoked and you mobilized active duty military into the streets and that inflamed more violence, could someone then make the argument, could someone then sue the New York Times and say, because you published this view, you caused physical harm, and therefore you are liable. Now, I think that would be absurd myself, but like, would that be the argument?
I don't. I've heard even the harshest critics of the Times go that far. It's an op-ed, and defamation is about reckless disregard for truth. So you need to identify some descriptive statement, not just prescriptive, but something that Senator Cotton said that is descriptively either flat out wrong or shows a reckless disregard for truth. And you'd need to show causation between that and some sort of harm, whether, again, with defamation I don't think he defamed any person with an op-ed. Again, an op-ed I very much disagree with, but I don't think he defamed a person with it. I'm not sure exactly what the harm would be. The intentional infliction of emotional distress, these things would be, I think, pretty far-fetched. But again, this brings us back to something I said earlier in our conversation, which is that the law isn't always our answer, guides our answer, or constrains our answers. I think the question of really two questions. One, do we agree with what Senator Cotton was recommending and urging in the piece? And two, what do we think about the New York Times selecting that piece and publishing it? I'm not sure. I think the law helps us answer the first one, actually. I think it helps us by looking at what the Insurrection Act means and what its prerequisites are and what it's intended to facilitate. But the law may not give us an answer as to whether the Times should publish it, or ultimately even to whether it's a good idea. Instead, there's room for judgment and morality and propriety that may fall short of lawful, unlawful, that's fair game to talk about too.
What is your view of what in what situations the Insurrection Act can be used? My understanding is that Eisenhower, Kennedy, and LBJ used it. We used it in the '92 riots. I think most people would, like, if they took the time to read through U.S. statute, they'd be surprised at how much authority we've given to the federal government over the years. But what is your view that it's antiquated or it's just non-operative in this point? Like, if you're going to make have a debate with Tom on this issue, what would be your view?
Yeah, and it may be helpful to talk about one also really, really old law, the Posse Comitatus Act, which in some ways is why we're all talking about the Insurrection Act. So if you'll indulge me, the Posse Comitatus Act.
I've indulged you too long, Joshua.
Keep it up. It's taking you places. So Posse Comitatus, it bars the president from using the military on U.S. soil for law enforcement functions. So think about arrests, searches, seizures, unless there's an explicit legal authority enabling the president to do so. The legal authority the president has tended to look to as checking that box, as fulfilling that requirement of Posse Comitatus, is the Insurrection Act. So we're now saying, is this the right law to trigger the U.S. military providing assistance to law enforcement on U.S. soil? And what the Insurrection Act talks about uses the word rebellion, and it talks about either rebellion or an utter inability to restore and enforce the law such that use by the president of the military has been necessitated. I just don't think those prerequisites are met by what we're seeing right now. We're seeing a lot of peaceful protest. We're seeing some violence. And like, I'm a former Justice Department and national lawyer. I'm not going to sit here and say that looting is okay. I'm not going to sit here and say that violence is okay. It's not. But is what we're seeing across the country right now rebellion? Is what we're seeing in the country now an utter inability to restore the enforcement of the rule of law? I don't think so. And that's where I probably would depart from Senator Cotton's description of the facts on the ground, which then would shape, I think, a debate between him and me as to whether the law is entitled to be invoked by the president in the first place.
So does the fact that it was used in prior cases that may also not have met the definition of rebellion, just as a legal matter, and I actually don't know enough to go back to the empirical record and say whether it was used or misused, does that then create a precedent that allows, the current president or even a future president to use it in more expansive ways?
It's a great question. And this is why I think being an executive branch lawyer is both really fun and fulfilling as I found it, but also there's a lot of responsibility to it, because a lot of things that executive branch lawyers think about and advise the president on and sometimes write down in executive orders or proclamations or whatever form they take, they don't necessarily get then assessed by a court. We think of the legal system as one based on adversarialism, not in the sense of you and me on the basketball court, but in the sense of two people making arguments, two sets of lawyers making arguments from both sides, and then a hopefully impartial adjudicator assessing those arguments and deciding which one should carry the day. A lot of the lawyering you do, especially on security issues, sometimes on law enforcement issues in the executive branch, they don't get that. They don't get brought to court. They don't get decided by a judge. That's because of classification. That's because of all sorts of doctrines our courts have either created or adapted about what they are willing to review. It's a lot of deference to the executive even when they think there's something to review. So this is a long answer to say executive branch lawyers really can carry a lot of weight. Now, when they write down something, let's say when they write down some justification for the use of the invocation of the Insurrection Act during the Rodney King inspired riots or even earlier episodes, it's not precedent like judicial precedent. It's not the Supreme Court writing down a majority opinion that binds it unless it overturns its precedent and binds lower federal courts. But it does carry some weight. Certainly, if you're an executive branch lawyer, you look back at what those came before you have done and why they thought it was the right answer then as you try to provide the best answers you can now. So it carries some weight. It's not the same as judicial precedent, but it certainly shapes, I think, how executive branch lawyers think. Now, it's also worth looking at those episodes to see how localized, right? President Bush invoked it for LA or the LA area. Eisenhower sent troops in to certain place. Unless I've missed something, it's not clear to me what President Trump or the Attorney General has in mind. Is he thinking of this nationwide? Is he thinking of this in some particular city? If so, which one? Which city does he think law and order has just been totally forsaken and acquire it? So part of what I get out of those earlier episodes is, if you're going to invoke the law, the facts may or may not, but if they do, they may merit it in some limited geography, as those earlier executive branches seem to conclude. And it would make me particularly worried to see it just invoked writ large, meaning, I suppose, nationwide for now.
Well, I think there was added confusion because, as I understand it, the president in D.C. is the commander of the National Guard in D.C. or in charge of the National Guard. And so there was I sort of think about this in three concentric circles of like, you have, your law enforcement professionals. In Northeast Wisconsin, we don't need, at least in Appleton and Green Bay, we don't need the military because we have great law enforcement professionals. But our Democratic governor has used the National Guard in Madison, for example, where they're having some problems. But then the third sort of level is active duty military. But in D.C., at least, there's some confusion because the president has authority over the National Guard there. Am I right on that one?
You're totally right. This is so important. I'm so glad. I think this is something that had been confused in the conversations, and you are sorting it out just right. In other words, National Guard in all 50 states reports to the governor unless it is federalized, unless it is put under the command of the president, and that is considered a dramatic step that has both legal prerequisites and legal consequences. D.C. has no governor. And so the National Guard doesn't need to get federalized. The National Guard always is under the command of the president. And so for the president and those who work for him to make use of the National Guard in D.C., whether a good or a bad idea based on the facts around in D.C., it is at least somewhat analogous to the governors of states using their own National Guards, and it is not the same as the president invoking the Insurrection Act, federalizing the National Guards or taking them out of the reporting structure in which they report to state governors and instead putting them in control of the federal government, or otherwise using the military under the Insurrection Act authorities.
So last question, I want to do final 5 minutes of fun, and I'm sorry that we went on here.
Sure.
But I'm just more confused, and I'm not smart enough to argue with you, and I haven't gone to law school, so this is like a triple whammy here. Do you now that I've lost my train of thought? Has the Insurrection Act has a challenge to the Insurrection Act ever gotten up to the Supreme Court? Like, was there anyone who, after Rodney King, said that was wrong, you shouldn't have used that, and it worked its way through the court system?
That's a great question, and I'll be wary, as I do when I answer my law students' questions, of ever saying there's never been a case without running it down and checking it. But I can say this: I'm not aware of that case arising after King. And it may be implicit in your question is, would a court scrutinize this if someone challenged the president were he to go down this road? And there are a lot of doctrines that make courts either deem certain questions hands off, political questions, and other reasons they don't want to touch a case, or if they even are willing to look at them, they defer a lot to the executive, especially on matters of national security. At the same time, the Insurrection Act is a federal law, just like every other federal law. It has words written down, and those words, they don't have obvious, totally crisp and clear meaning as applied to every case, but no law does. They do have meaning. They do have something they're trying to articulate must be met before an authority can be invoked. And so I guess I would hope, in other words, that if the president were to invoke a law really without seeming to meet the statutory prerequisites, and if somebody were to go to court, that courts wouldn't simply throw up their hands. Because ultimately, whatever one thinks of particular politics, the courts are a bastion of some independent check on sometimes the Congress, and like you there, sometimes the executive branch, sometimes both, acting together. And I think we need the courts to be playing a role right now because our democracy is definitely facing some challenges.
Well, I think there's going to be a few really interesting court battles or legal questions, right? I mean, this question of qualified immunity for police officers is kind of uniting the libertarian right and some on the left right now. I wonder if all this is bound up in debates over the non-delegation doctrine and to what extent Congress can write vague law in which it says the executive branch can do X, Y, Z, and then we get into all sorts of problems. You're going to have a very interesting set of classes in the future with all this stuff. And then we talked about encryption. I mean, encryption could be a whole... I worked for a year on a cyber commission recently, and we couldn't come up with an answer on encryption. There is perhaps no more divisive issue or difficult issue right now in national security law, as far as I'm concerned. But you don't have to comment on all those, Josh, unless you want.
No, it's hard. I'll tell you, in the national security law class that I co-teach with my friend, a great national security lawyer herself, Mary McCord, we spend a whole day just having the students read the briefings on both sides when the government, on the one side, the federal government, and Apple fight over access to the San Bernardino shooters' phones. And it's a rare instance where we don't read Supreme Court decisions or we don't read executive branch opinions. Have them read the briefs in that, in part because the case ended somewhat prematurely before it worked its way through the courts because the government apparently was able to get into the phone another way, in part because the arguments on both sides are so interesting, so hard, in some ways seem to talk past each other so much. I don't mean that as a sign of bad lawyering. It's wonderful lawyering because they're calling attention to very different issues and consequences for how the court might rule. That it's one of my favorite sessions to teach of the year, but teaching something that's hard and has arguments on both sides, that's easy. You all who are working as legislators and those of you who served on the Solarium Commission trying to grapple with recommendations, it's really hard.
Yeah. Okay, so in a few minutes, let's do some fun stuff here. We'll go highbrow and we'll go lowbrow. So what, when you weren't teaching and, pontificating about the law don't go around here, law dog. Have you read anything good during the shutdown? Any fiction in particular that we should be aware of?
Oh, fiction. That's a good question. Yes.
Do you read fiction?
Book, and you're going to love this book. Yes. So I highly recommend a book that just came out called Burn In by my friend Peter. Yeah. Have you read it, Mike?
I have read the first 30 pages. I got an electronic copy. They actually wrote Singer and Cole the the opener to our
Mostly.
Solarium Commission report, which is like a futuristic scenario of the wake of a cyber attack.
That's right. I forgot they had done that. So this book is much like what I thought was a fantastic intro, and it was fantastic of all of you on the commission to indulge the idea of fiction as an intro.
Well, clearly it wasn't if you
because
didn't remember it, Josh.
That's because I'm so overwhelmed by their later work.
That's right.
But that's what Vernon does. It does something similar. It uses fiction to tee up in very concrete, very palpable form questions about the use of technology, the use of in law enforcement, for surveillance, artificial intelligence, robotics. It's, I think, a terrific novel, just a novel, but especially for policy wonks like us, it raises some really interesting questions in non-dry ways.
Love that. And Ghost Fleet, their previous novel, was one of my favorites. What about some lowbrow stuff? You know, we both have a mutual passion for movies. Josh, have you watched anything good recently, or just Netflix series that you've gotten addicted to? Did you watch Tiger King? Just confess to us your lowbrow addictions.
Tiger King. I absolutely did Tiger King. We worked our way through it. We were as fascinated, traumatized, confused as the rest of the country. I don't know what that show would have been like if we all had just retreated into our homes when it came out and we're looking for something totally bizarre to captivate us. But that's where we were, and boy, did it deliver. But I'm going to give a strange recommendation here, Mike. I had been working with my kids to go back through Star Wars. I'm not, a particular Star Wars guy. I've watched them all, enjoy them all. So with them, we've done 4, 5, 6. Then we went back and did 1, 2, and 3.
You did machete order, or almost machete order.
Yeah, I wanted them to experience it the way that they were made. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say episode 3 is actually pretty good. The kids have declared it maybe their favorite of those original 3. I think that's probably right about those 3. It's pretty good.
Well,
it's not 4, 5, and 6.
That's those 3, Josh. That's like saying, I'm the best baseball player on the Hunter Hawks. It's not a big achievement.
No, it's not. But look, I'm trying to find something nice to say about those early episodes. You don't hear people raising them just to say nice things about them very often these days.
Well, what about 7, 8, and 9?
We got to get there.
Oh, you're not there yet.
What's coming next? No, we just did 3
gonna have
last.
back. We're going to do a couple hours on Star Wars because I have strong thoughts, very, very strong thoughts on that. You guys should watch The Mandalorian though. That's really good. On Disney Plus. Okay. Did you watch The Last Dance? That's my final lowbrow.
No, I have not seen it yet. I feel like
love it.
That especially with is it worth it?
Oh, it's totally worth it. It's awesome. My wife loved it too. I mean, just that period of basketball. I mean, all those teams were so great. It wasn't just the Bulls. I mean, the Jazz, Malone, Stockton. I mean, the Magic were good, and then Horace Grant went to the Magic. The whole thing is amazing. And you just forget like how pervasive Michael Jordan was at the time. Like the guy was just dominated everything. Space Jam, underrated movie too.
I've never seen that one, and I'm not sure that I'm going to take that step.
Perfect. I
noticed you didn't mention among the great teams of the year. I noticed you didn't mention my New York Knicks, who may have fallen on hard times these days, but we had some good fights against the Bulls in the Jordan era.
That's true. Well, I did on an airplane recently watch Uncut Gems, which is this Adam Sandler movie, but it's a serious movie in which Kevin Garnett's the main character, and it follows him when he's with the Celtics. But the guys who made it are huge Knicks fans, and the Knicks sort of the agony is kind of in the background of the whole thing. Okay, so final question. Serious question. Next time you come to Wisconsin, let's say we're hanging out, we're debating these issues, and someone comes up to you and says, Professor Geltzer, Dr. Geltzer, I'm a huge fan. I listen to the podcast. I really want to pursue a career in both law and national security. What advice would you have for that young Wisconsinite?
First of all, I'd be saying you're coming from the right state. I'm glad to be back in Wisconsin because I've only gotten to be there once. It was for your wedding. And so
you're huge here, man. You're huge here.
After this podcast, I will be.
Oh yeah.
But I would, if somebody wants to go down that road, I think grappling with technology and, frankly, reading books like Burn In, but also digging into coding, which I'm not a coder, I don't know how to do, understanding some of the emerging technology. If we're going to have people able to talk about the law, the policy, the ethics of offensive cyber operations, of semi-autonomous weapon systems, about all this, we need that technology element in them strong as the legal element and the policy element. And that's something that I think people absorb in some ways most easily when they are young, when they're still in school, have the opportunity, if not to take whole courses, maybe to audit a bit, maybe to try to tack on where they can. But I would urge him or her the technology piece as well, if you want to grapple with where national security law and policy are going in decades.
That is great advice. I would add to it that young Wisconsinite should try and model themselves after you, because I meant what I said at the beginning, that even in areas where we disagree, I think you're exceptionally intellectually honest, and you care about the country deeply. And so thank you for challenging my thinking in this conversation. This is an area where I really struggle, and you've really helped me and hopefully our tens of listeners now with the whole thing. And Josh, really thank you for your time. Thanks for joining the New Look podcast.
Thank you, my friend. This was fun. Appreciate all that you do.
All right, my friend. Let's play basketball when we're allowed to soon. Again.
I'm going to start sharpening my elbows.
That's right.
The dude abides, yeah. The dude abides. The dude abides, yeah. The dude abides.